Microsoft is announcing even more job cuts, and the tech giant is not going to be the only one. Why? Today's CPI numbers have all the answers. Even as the government reported the lowest annual rate for consumer prices since February 2021, what sounds like good news actually shows that businesses are having an enormously difficult time passing along higher costs to their customers. And if they can't raise their selling prices, they're going to have to cut back somewhere else, which is usually their workforce. As that filters out more and more into the wider economy, it leads to a downward spiral where cost cutting by employers creates a broader pullback in spending that means even more labor reductions and so on. Tariffs aren't working their way through into consumer prices as many people had feared simply because they overestimated and overstated the strength of the economy, which has been a big problem ever since the vibe session. Because of that overstated strength, there's this idea that any trouble in 2025 was manufactured solely by tariffs, and therefore trade deals will remove the entire threat. That's the part many people have trouble understanding, and largely because it has been covered up the whole time. Some of this misleading has been intentional through gross distortions, but much of it is simply bad data. And the implications are enormous, both in the long run as well as in the short run, especially as markets are ripping ahead based on the idea that trade wars broke it, therefore trade deals can fix it. But the CPI, along with another critical update on the pre-existing ill health in the labor market, what all that shows is that popular imagination has the economics, small e economics, all wrong. First, though, what Microsoft reported earlier this morning. On Tuesday, it said it's laying off 3% of employees across all level teams and geographies. Quote, "We continue to implement organizational changes necessary to best position the company for success in a dynamic marketplace." That's what a Microsoft spokesman said in a statement to CNBC, filled with the same usual buzzwords. One objective is to reduce layers of management, the spokesman said. In January, for example, Amazon announced that it was getting rid of some employees after noticing, quote, "unnecessary layers in its organization." This is just pure cost-cutting behavior. And Microsoft isn't that bad off. So if Microsoft is saying, hey, let's get rid of some of the inefficiencies, let's trim our costs somewhat, what does that say about businesses further down the line that are struggling a whole bunch more? And that's the point here. Businesses are struggling because consumers are struggling because the economy is not strong and resilient, and it never was. It was weak long before we got to 2025. What they all dismissed as a vibe session, now the consequences are beginning to show up more concretely. And they sure did in the Consumer Price Index for the month of April 2025. Defying expectations that we'd begin to see a tariff impact. Well, we're supposed to see a tariff impact in March, and that didn't happen. And it didn't happen in April either. The monthly rate came in at just 0.22%, which was up slightly from what had been the lowest monthly rate for the CPI in March, going back to 2020. And February's number was only 0.22% as well. So you're talking about 3 straight months now of seriously disinflationary conditions when prices were supposed to be going farther ahead. That's what the Fed has kept saying. We're not really sure how consumer prices are going to play out based on all the tariffs and all the threats of tariffs and all the implications from all over the rest of the world. Because of that 3 months of disinflation, the annual rate in the CPI was just 2.34%, which is the lowest year-over-year rate since early 2021, the lowest of the cycle so far. Even the core rate continues to be disinflationary at 0.24% month over month. It was only that high because of the continued imputations and fakery due to shelter prices. Shelter imputations aren't real. They're not a reflection of the economy as it is right now today. At best, it's the housing market and what it looked like maybe 18 months ago. When you exclude shelter imputations from the Consumer Price Index, it gets even, depending on your perspective, better or worse. If you're looking at this from the perspective of individual consumers, it gets better. But if you're looking at this from a macroeconomic perspective, from the top down, this is actually worse. Excluding shelter prices, but including everything else in the consumer price bucket, the monthly change was just 0.16%, which followed a minus 0.2% rate in March. So for the 2 months, all other prices except for shelter are actually down. And it goes back into February where the all items less shelter was up just 0.1% month over month, and that month. So again, 3 straight months where consumer prices outside of the fakery and shelter are basically going nowhere. And 2 out of those 3 months were supposed to have been when the tariff impact really started. So while the Fed is out there saying we're really afraid of the inflationary impact of tariffs, the real economy suggests that businesses who might want to be passing along those costs, and they are experiencing rising costs, are unable to do so in any significant way. It's not showing up in the CPI, which is one reason why businesses are saying, we don't really like where everything is going here. And that's why consumers are saying the same thing, because they can see all of this add up to the same thing, which is that prices aren't going up because the economy's weak. The economy's weak because of the labor market, and labor knows it's going to get even worse because businesses are being squeezed by increasing costs and that weak economy that pre-existed all of this stuff. It gets into this potentially the vicious cycle that leads to businesses having no other alternatives, those that are certainly much worse off than Microsoft, having no other alternative but to cut back on costs even more, meaning less hours, less work, less jobs, maybe even less positions for workers, less pay, less income, therefore less spending, and on it goes. By the way, staying on top of all of this stuff that economics misses, and it's a lot as if you couldn't tell, that's what we do here at Eurodollar University, especially in our subscriptions like the deep dive analysis. The deep dive analysis goes beyond the headlines, deep into the primary source material to get at some facts and truth, some useful facts and truth. Extensive investigations into all the critical topics, whether they be money and macro in many places. Most cases, it's money and macro together. What markets are really telling us about the economic situation to stay informed, because economics is not going to do it. You can't rely on central bankers, and you do need to go beyond the headlines. And that's why Eurodollar University exists. So check out our deep dive analysis and our other subscriptions too at our website, eurodollar.university. But even now, mainstream media sources, because of economics, capital E economics, can't really make sense of what they're seeing. Here's an example from today. The CPI report highlights 2 underlying dynamics in the economy. Goods categories exposed to higher tariffs, including new cars and apparel, didn't see the kind of price increases that economists had expected by now. That suggests importers and retailers are absorbing some of the extra costs, and imported goods being sold now had arrived before the brunt of tariffs, namely on China, were in effect. And while that's maybe technically true, that some importers and some companies, some retailers may be absorbing costs, Walmart certainly springs to mind, they're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They're not doing it because they love their customers. They would actually love to be able to pass on their costs to the customers, but what they're saying is, we can't. And so this framing in this article makes it sound almost passive, like, okay, retailers are absorbing the cost. What that really says is that retailers can't pass those costs on to customers, and therefore you need to ask why that's the case. And funny enough, this same article answers it in the very next paragraph when they say, separately, some weakness in services categories like travel and recreation suggest consumers are cutting on leisure and other discretionary spending. The limited pass-through from tariffs could be seen in so-called core goods prices, which exclude food and energy, and barely rose in April per the CPI data. Yes, what they're saying is the business environment is so weak, businesses themselves cannot pass their rising costs on to customers. They're not choosing to do this voluntarily. They're doing so by force, and that force is the weaker economy than most people appreciate. The labor market has been bad for a long period of time, but because people think it's been good, they attribute this dynamic to it must be trade, it must be tariffs. That's what's changed. The economy was strong and all of a sudden it doesn't appear to be strong. It must be that tariffs broke everything down. When in fact the economy was much weaker than people appreciated before we ever got to this position. And we have a whole range of data that shows this. Everybody looks at the establishment survey, the payroll number, as the gold standard for what we should believe as far as labor market conditions. It is supposed to be the single representation of employment in the United States. And at one time it may have been. But over the last several years in particular, it has become one of the least reliable statistics out there. So while Jay Powell exclusively points to the establishment survey because he knows the household survey looks completely different, while he says, look at the establishment survey, it says it's really solid, The truth is you can't rely on the establishment survey to begin with. It has way overstated job gains for way too long. And so people who've only been following the economy based on the headline payroll number have been wildly misled, sometimes, maybe oftentimes, on purpose. That's what the whole vibe session thing was. So what the BLS has been doing is trying to force a positive trend into a data series when the actual economy doesn't fit the trend. And so what has happened is the BLS estimates job gains that sound terrific, only to very quietly, and sometimes a long time into the future, completely revise all of its estimates. Just in the first 3 months of this year so far, the initial releases for January, February, and March were 143,000, 151,000, and 228,000 respectively. But now the BLS says after just the initial revisions, January was only 111, not 143. February was only 102, not 151. There's a 33% miss. And March, which was supposed to be the strong one at 228, is now thought to have been just 185, and there's one more revision coming. And so just doing the math, what that shows is the average monthly revisions, just in the short run, for the 3 months of 2025 so far, a whopping 41,000. So if you apply that to April was 177,000, that means that we should expect it to be really something more along the lines of 136. And 136 is only where it starts. Because you go back to last year and before, between the period of January and October of last year, the average revision between the initial estimate that was reported in the mainstream media and everywhere else and the current estimates for what those months actually ended up being, 67.8 thousand. So if you apply that to the April figure of 177,000, you're barely at 100,000. And it actually gets worse than that. So what we're basically saying is that the establishment survey that everybody looks at to tell them what the labor market is doing, the most charitable interpretation is that's the absolute best possibility for employment conditions, when in reality, the employment conditions are almost certainly to be so much weaker. The economy has been a lot weaker, especially where it comes to employment, than most people have been led to believe. First of all, by bad data, and second of all, by a lot of people who've been using bad data for their own purposes. They've been misled over the strength of the economy. So you get to 2025 and you think if everything's starting to go wrong, it must be because of tariffs, and therefore trade deals can fix it. I also talked recently with Steve about productivity. Productivity was deeply negative in the first quarter. In fact, it's a sign that everything that I've said in this video so far, up to including the CPI numbers for April, are exactly what they appear to be. Low and negative productivity for economists, capital E economists, is not enough supply side investment. There's not enough innovation. Some of them describe demographic challenges, but for them it's long run processes. They're supposed to increase the supply side potential of the economy, and when that doesn't happen, productivity suffers. That's the textbook definition. Others say, well, maybe low productivity is simply lazy Americans who aren't working hard enough to maintain higher levels of productivity. It's neither of those. This productivity measure is actually proof the economy sucks, that the vibe session wasn't a vibe session, it was a real recession. Low and negative productivity really means that there's not enough work for the workers that companies have hired or kept on. And a huge example of this is 2021 and 2022. I keep saying that was all a price illusion. There was no recovery. And the economy that came out of 2021 and 2022 that forgot how to grow, productivity provides the proof for it, why it actually happened. Because in 2021 and 2022, while prices were soaring ahead, making it look like the economy was roaring, instead, while businesses were bringing back some of the employees that they had let go during the pandemic and lockdowns, thinking that maybe a recovery was actually going to happen, only they found that volume was not recovering. Revenues increased, prices per unit increased, but they weren't actually making and selling and servicing as much as they had been before. So they were bringing in employees expecting a real recovery, only to find it was all the price illusion. And what happens when you have more workers than you actually need to produce work and output? Well, you stop hiring. That's where the forgot how to hire, forgot how to grow economy came from. Productivity stopped rising. It quickly reversed right in 2021, and then it fell sharply in the first half of 2022. So of course businesses stopped hiring. Why bring in more workers when you don't have enough work for the ones you did rehire? So the forgot how to grow economy started well before we get to 2025, and all of our economic problems that have been building since then over the years trace back to that problem. It's not tariffs, it's the fact that there was no actual legitimate recovery in 2021 and 2022, and the labor market therefore has been way short of where it needs to be, where it's needed to be the entire time since then. And the errors only get stronger and stronger and stronger. They compound more and more and more, lead to more economic weakness, not less, long before we get to tariffs and trade restrictions. And if that wasn't enough for the labor market, the BLS also reported very recently on another data series that shows yet again that everyone's picture of the labor market situation is way overstated. And this is a more comprehensive view of it too, like the QCEW. In fact, this is drawn from the QCEW. The problem is because it is a comprehensive data source, it takes a long time to compile all the statistics and then get them into whatever format they need to be in and then publish them. So the data we have from the BED survey, or what they call BDM survey now, is only for the third quarter of last year. It's called the Business Employment Dynamics, and this is how the BLS describes it. Business employment dynamics are quarterly series of gross job gains and gross job losses statistics for the entire economy. These data track changes in employment at the establishment level, meaning employers, and thus provide a picture of the dynamics underlying aggregate net employment growth statistics. The microdata used to construct the gross job gains and gross job losses statistics come from the QCEW, or Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages. These data include all establishments subject to state unemployment insurance laws and federal agencies subject to the Unemployment Compensation of Federal Employees program. So basically they draw from unemployment taxes, which is the most comprehensive source that they've got, which means that this is really the gold standard for employment. And since they track job gains versus job losses, because there's always a regular churn in the economy, this goes way beyond JOLTS. What it shows is that, like I've been saying, the establishment survey has wildly overstated job gains over the last couple of years in particular, very critical last couple of years. So for the latest data, the third quarter of 2024, so while we were getting into the summertime of recession, while the payroll reports suddenly looked a lot better heading into 2025, what the QCEW and the BDM program suggests is that no, not even close. For the third quarter of last year, according to the BDM, net gains were 7.62 million, while net losses were 7.62 million, for an actual net job losses of about 1,000. So basically the same jobs gains and losses, which is not at all the 400,000 increase that was reported by the BLS. And I mean 400,000 increase as of the current statistics, let alone the initial releases that were reported at the time that they were given. And that followed the second quarter of 2024, where according to the BDM numbers, net job gains were 7.59 million, while net job losses were 7.75 million, for a net of 163,000 jobs lost in the second quarter. What does the establishment survey show for the same time period? Almost exactly the same as what it shows for the third quarter, 398,000, which goes to show how fake these numbers are when they keep repeating the same numbers through quarterly periods. So again, the BDM survey shows atypical weakness in employment and in employment gains during a period when everybody thought the economy was strong and resilient, most of all, the employment condition. Jay Powell kept saying so, and the BLS data initially said that he was right, but now says he was completely wrong. And by the way, the BDM or BED survey, quarterly negatives for these are incredibly rare. You don't see them outside of recessionary periods for what should be obvious reasons. The only one that you do, the one outlier, was the third quarter of 2017, which was minus 39,000. But here in 2024, the latest data that we have, we had 2 straight quarterly negatives, which is recession-like behavior. The BDM survey turned negative in the third quarter of 2007, just before the Great Not Recession started. Did the same thing in the first quarter of 2001, just before the dot-com recession started. But prior to the first quarter of 2001, since the series was implemented back in the third quarter of 1992, there were 0 negatives throughout the entire 1990s. So what I'm saying is that a negative for the BDM survey, especially since it's drawn from the biggest coverage possible, directly from tax reporting, a negative from the BDM survey for any quarter, let alone 2 in a row, atypical degree and level of weakness in the labor market, and that's only through the third quarter of last year. This is why consumer surveys keep coming back and saying jobs and incomes, jobs and incomes, jobs and incomes. Because the labor market, first of all, never kept up with the price changes, and more importantly, it didn't come back from the pandemic. Jobs were lost and were never recovered because the economy sucked the entire time. It was not a vibe session. It really was a bad situation. So what that means is trade wars didn't break the economy. Trade deals won't fix it. The labor market was unusually weak long before 2025, and everyone largely tuned it out. They called it a vibe session, but now it's coming back to really haunt everyone. So much so that consumer prices have barely budged for 3 months running, in 2 of those months with tariffs being applied in increasing ways. And the US labor market is hardly the only evidence for this weak economy heading into 2025. We've seen it in Canada, we've seen it in Japan, South Korea, China, the UK, which just reported another negative payroll number today. All over the world shows that the situation before we got to trade wars was bad to begin with. So trade wars, tariffs didn't break the world, and trade deals aren't going to fix it. Instead, we've got long-standing weakness that we're now coming to grips with because the original sin here. The world was impoverished by the pandemic, and the bill for it is still yet to be coming due. And that's what all this data is showing, that it is coming due in a way that no one is really prepared for. All of this is one big reason why investors and markets are becoming increasingly concerned about the state of global banks. Went over all the details there in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.